6 months ago today, 22-year-old Mahsa Amini died in the custody of Iran's morality police, setting off a wave of protests unlike anything seen in Iran since the 1979 revolution. Now, the movement opened up a Pandora's box of demands spanning from gender equality to more freedoms, even the resignation of the hardline government. Well, Parisa Brody from France 24's Observer's Desk joins me on set now. The Observer's team has been closely following these protests, which are now known as the Women, Life, Freedom Revolution. Hi there, Parisa. Thank you for joining us today. So in the first few months of the protests, we were seeing lots of images from Iran, the videos of people chanting, Iranian women burning their headscarves, even cutting their hair. Lately, though, we've seen a little bit less. Is this revolution then already over?
No, it's definitely not over. Even just 2 days ago, there were mass protests around Iran. That was for an occasion that was known as the Fire Festival. That's a tradition that's held every year in Iran. It's a week before the Iranian New Year. And generally during this festival, people light fireworks. They jump over these bonfires that they set. But this year, women were burning their headscarves in those fires. And people were chanting these iconic slogans that you've heard throughout the protests. Slogans like women, life, freedom, death to the dictator, death to Khamenei, which is Iran's supreme leader. And in some cities, protesters were even using firecrackers to go after security forces. And these protests generally seem to show that Iranians are still filled with discontent over the regime. So as you know, these protests began over Islamic veiling laws, the death of Mahsa Amini, and these lack of social freedoms. But they've also reflected much more economic issues, like many Iranians who were middle class just a few months ago are now living below the poverty line. And on top of that, political freedom is also very limited in Iran, since most political offices are controlled either directly or indirectly by the supreme leader. And in the face of all this, Iranians are just taking every opportunity that they can to still protest the regime. But their efforts are being met with a lot of harsh repression. So far in the protests, nearly 500 protesters have been killed. Thousands more have been severely injured, and tens of thousands have been arrested.
So how are Iranian protesters then evolving? How is the movement changing in order to adapt to the brutal repression by security forces?
Right. In the first few months of the movement, you would see this tendency among protesters to gather just in one place. You'd have tens of thousands of people all in one main street. But what's changed in the last couple of months is that protesters came up with this idea to have maybe more guerrilla-style protests, you could say. So instead of gathering in large numbers in one single place, which is much easier for security forces to shut down easily, they gather in smaller groups in different neighborhoods all at the same time. And so we've seen a lot of videos of protests like these at the Observers, and they look less impressive, fewer people around, but they show that the protests are definitely still continuing, but just in a different form. And one of those forms is actually strikes. So we've been seeing strikes from all over Iran, from pensioners, from bakers, teachers, industrial workers, and especially in the oil and iron industries are all going on strike. And one last thing that's important to mention is that there's quieter, maybe more subversive forms of protest going on. For example, every time an Iranian woman chooses to leave her house without wearing the headscarf, that is itself a form of protest because she's defying the laws imposed on Iranian women since 1979.
Certainly. So I think 6 months on is a pretty reasonable amount of time to assess what impact the movement has had. What changes, if any, have these protests had on Iranian society now?
One of the things that we've noticed that has changed mainly is that more and more women in Iran are really daring to go out in public places without wearing the mandatory headscarf. So we've seen a lot of videos of this on social media. You'll see a few of them playing behind me. And it's still illegal in Iran for women not to cover their hair, and the morality police are still patrolling the streets. But the fact is the system is simply overwhelmed by the sheer number of Iranian women who really are just leaving home without their headscarves. We've been at the Observer speaking to women all over Iran. We spoke to one woman in Tehran who wanted to stay anonymous for her safety, but I'll read you what she told us. She said, "I never wear a headscarf anymore. I go out on the street, I go to cafes, even to banks, and I took a flight without wearing a headscarf. Until a month or two ago, men and other women would smile at me when I went for a walk in public and say encouraging words like, 'well done,' or 'I'm proud of you.' Now I've been seeing for weeks that not wearing a headscarf has become the norm. People don't even see it as something special." So stories like this from our Observer, they don't only come from big cities like Tehran. They're actually happening even in Iran's smaller towns, which are generally more conservative. It really seems like the tide has turned even there. And so I'll read you one more quote from a woman we spoke to from a small town in Iran. She said, I have seen many women walking the streets in our town without headscarves and teenage girls chatting and laughing in the street without hijabs. Not wearing the hijab as a sign of boldness or at best weirdness has turned into a political act, a sign of courage to stand up for one's rights. So both of these women, they told us they see these changes as actually irreversible in Iranian society. And that's regardless of any pushback coming from the state, which itself has tried to counter this by closing businesses where the employees or the clients try to go out without their hijabs, without their headscarves. But the fact is, both of our observers, at least 2 women in Iran, they told us they just won't wear the headscarf again, no matter what.
Proof that even the smallest actions really can make a difference. Parisa Brody from the Observer's Desk at France 24, thank you very much.